Chapter 1: Origins, My Family, and the Organization. I'll briefly focus on the origins of my family, considering my grandparents and their roots. My dad's father came from a family with German roots. My ancestor Peter Stephan, later Stevens, came from a region near what is now Heidelberg, Germany, or Baden-Württemberg, or what was at that time the Holy Roman Empire in the late 1600s. They would settle in what were the British colonies in the early 1700s and build their home in what is now Stevens City, Virginia, in the vicinity of Winchester in northern Virginia. During the American Civil War, it would be at the northern extremity of the Confederacy. His forebears would eventually settle in Boonville, Missouri, and from there my great-grandfather would come to Colorado at the turn of the 20th century. My great-grandfather, Lon Stevens, was an atheist and a Democrat. My German forebears have been Protestants. I sometimes wonder what caused him to choose his path in philosophy. He would meet and marry my great-grandmother, Pearl Maxey, in Golden, Colorado, about 1903 to 1904. I do not have much information on Pearl, but my mom passed information on to me after my dad's death that Pearl's ancestors were French Protestants who had come to the New World to escape persecution in the Old One. My great-grandfather was an electrician by trade and would have a family of several children, of which my grandfather was one of the youngest. My grandpa would grow up in a secular, non-religious family after his birth in Helper, Utah, in 1923. My great-grandfather would settle with his family in the region of Nadarita, Nucla, after supposedly being economically frozen out of Utah by the Mormons. Nadarita is a small town on Colorado's western slope between Grand Junction and Durango. It was here later on that my grandfather would meet my grandmother around Montrose, Colorado, during the 1930s. My dad's mother was fully Irish by descent. Her father's forebears had come from Decatur City, Iowa during the Civil War in 1862 and settled in what is now Monument, Colorado, north of Colorado Springs. Effectively, they came with people who ripped this area away from the Native Americans for the sake of expansion and mining the area's resources. It was the leadership of these people who would later be responsible for the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 in the southeastern part of the Colorado Territory, where some 69 to 600 Native American men, women, and children would be slaughtered. Today I reflect on this as I see tremendous growth from people coming to Colorado from all over the world. I've seen many changes. Some I feel are not for the better, but recall the Native Americans of this place had no choice in the matter when the whites came for the lands. My great-grandfather, Charles Geyer, was born in Castle Rock, Colorado in 1879, 100 years before my birth. He would eventually make his way to Telluride, Colorado at the turn of the 20th century, where he would meet my great-grandmother, Margaret, or Maggie Gould. My great-grandmother had a hard upbringing. At the time she was born, her mother died giving birth. The story I heard from my father was that she was placed in a Catholic convent in Durango, Colorado, sometime after her birth because her father, Dennis Gould of County Limerick, Ireland, blamed her for her mother's death. As a young woman, she would leave the convent and make her way up to Telluride, where she would meet my great-grandfather and marry in 1903. They would have 4 children, of which my grandmother was the third, born December 27, 1923, outside of Telluride in Placerville, Colorado. My mom's father came from a family, Anderson, of either Scottish or Swedish roots. His grandparents, Charles and Isabel Anderson, would settle in Aspen, Colorado from Wisconsin in the late 1800s, where they would have 3 children, of which my great-grandfather, Earl Anderson, was the oldest, born in 1891. I had heard a story from my mother that my great-grandfather was killed in a bar fight in Alamosa, Colorado, leaving Isabel to raise her children alone. According to information I would find on findagrave.com, Charles died December 7, 1907, exactly 72 years before my birth on December 7, 1979. For any who are interested in researching their family's roots, Find a Grave is an excellent source of information. Isabel would make her way with her family to Coldwater, Michigan, and would live there until her early death at the age of 51 in 1911. I visualize this picture of my great-grandfather caring for his siblings after his mother's death. At the time of her death, he would have been just 19. My great-grandfather would go on to meet Lavina Frary, with whom he'd have a family in Michigan and Ohio. My grandfather was born July 16, 1917, in Toledo, Ohio. My great-grandfather would eventually go back to his roots and settle in Denver, Colorado in the 1920s or 1930s. In Denver, my grandfather would become acquainted with my grandmother, who was her friend of siblings in school. My mom's mother was born in Max, Nebraska, March 2, 1924, the oldest daughter of Malcolm and Helen Sampson. My great-grandfather was a farmer in the southwestern corner of Nebraska at this time. He would move with his family to Denver in the 1930s. As it turns out, my grandfather would marry my grandmother after she had been married twice. Her first two husbands would die during World War II. She had come from a family with Swiss and French roots, Sampson. She had raised my mom's older half-brother, Bill Anderson, after giving birth to him at the age of 18. My grandfather was a family friend and married my grandmother in 1945 and adopted Bill as his own. Later, on November 9, 1947, my mother was born in Denver. Coming in contact with the organization. My dad's mother was the first to hear of Jehovah's Witnesses and join them. After marrying my grandfather during World War II, they settled in San Diego, California, and it was here my grandma would first come in contact with Jehovah's Witnesses. Later, after the war ended, my grandparents would settle in Cortez, Colorado. It was here she would come in contact with the JWs again, studying and being baptized in 1949. Before that, my father was born on February 5, 1947 in Durango, Colorado. As the story goes, my grandfather and his siblings were opposed to Jehovah's Witnesses. They were electricians in Cortez. I was told how my grandmother would be going from door to door, and what JWs referred to as field service, pushing my 2-year-old dad in a stroller. My grandfather would pass by in a truck yelling at her as she was going door to door. My grandpa at some point didn't take kindly to his brothers dreading my grandma, and he would eventually join the organization after moving to Grand Junction, Colorado, in the early 1950s. My dad's younger brother would be born there in 1951. In 1952, my dad's family would relocate again to Aurora, Colorado, on the east side of Denver. It was here in the late 50s that they would meet my mom's family after they accepted the truth. My mom's parents came in contact with Jehovah's Witnesses after moving to the older part of northern present-day Aurora in 1950. Jehovah's Witnesses would contact and convert them in 1958. Before that, they had been members of the Presbyterian Church. I recall my mom saying she felt awkward as a child when she went to services in church. Until 1958, their family had celebrated holidays, and my mom was more acquainted with the holidays than my father because he was a toddler when his mother became a JW in 1949. My parents' families would meet each other in the late 50s and attend the now famous International Convention in 1958 in New York City. At this time, there was just one congregation in Aurora, which only had a population of less than 50,000. At present, Aurora is Colorado's third largest city with over 386,000 people and several congregations of Jehovah's Witnesses. For my family, Aurora has much historical significance as the place they met and evolved as Jehovah's Witnesses. As my families came to know each other, my mom and dad would come closer to each other. I still recall my father telling me the organization did not have the same restrictions on dating as it does now, encouraging chaperones, etc. After dating, my parents would marry in 1967. Before this, my father had been a regular pioneer or a full-time evangelizer door to door with the Park Hill congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses in northeast Denver. Mom was 19 and Dad 20 at the time of their marriage. I still recall both of them saying they had been spiritually strong during their marriage. My mom would leave my dad on Christmas Day 1969 and later filed for divorce. There were people in their congregation that would take sides with both of them. After my mom left my father, he would attend a meeting, and the presiding overseer, or what would be equitable to a lead pastor in a church, approached him and bluntly said, "Why do you even bother? After hearing this, my dad immediately left and would not return to the organization for more than 2 decades, only returning in 1991. After this episode, he would work as a night auditor in a hotel in East Denver, and later as a miner at the Climax Mine near Leadville, Colorado. I still recall him saying 2 sisters approached his trailer as he was showering and knocked at his door in field service. Of course, he didn't answer it. My father avoided the draft for the Vietnam War with some type of religious exemption. I know there were many male JWs who weren't so fortunate and went to prison for their refusal to join. As the Vietnam War was winding down, it became known at the mine that the demand for molybdenum would greatly recede with the end of the war. My dad applied for work as a patrolman with the Aurora Police Department, and after testing and interviewing, joined on November 1st, 1971. He would continue as a police officer, retiring after 20 years on November 1st, 1991, with the rank of Detective Sergeant. After leaving my dad, my mom moved back in with her parents and lived with them for a time before moving to Arvada in the early 1970s. Living in an apartment building managed by her mom's parents, the Sampsons. In Arvada, she developed friendships that for her would last until this day. She met a sister, Vonnie, whom she would room with in an apartment on Nesta Street. I would also live in the same strip of apartments after leaving home in 1999. Vonnie is 12 years my mom's senior, having been born in 1935. She was originally from Saskatchewan, Canada, and along with her sister Gail would become close lifetime friends of my mom. Gail was married to another Canadian JW, Ernie, who had previously been a Bethelite or unpaid volunteer at the Canadian branch of Bethel. Ernie was originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba. During her time in Arvada, my mom was also a regular pioneer. She was employed with Frontier Airlines as a secretary, and from what I have been told, formed a relationship with a married man at the airline, for which she was censured by the elders of her congregation. Interestingly, she was not disfellowshipped, the organization's version of excommunication or shunning, but if I am not mistaken, she was privately reproved and would continue pioneering later on. During the same time period, my dad would date other women, none of whom were police officers, but nothing would come of it. At a later point, my dad would try to contact my mom, but would be intercepted by Vonnie over the phone saying, "She doesn't want to speak to you." At a later point, the elders of my mom's congregation in Arvada would encourage her to get back together with my father. This was most interesting because at this point my dad had been with the Aurora PD for a few years. In later years, he would tell me after so long he had written my mom off. It was my mom, after leaving him, who would pursue him again in 1975, at a time when Jehovah's Witnesses strongly felt the world or the system of things was about to end. My dad acquiesced to my mom and began dating her again over a year. On June 19, 1976, they remarried and moved into a house not far from my mom's parents in northern Aurora. After about 2 years, my mom strongly desired to return to Arvada to be close to her friends, and again my dad acquiesced. They moved into a home on Zephyr Street in northern Arvada, and it was here they lived when I was born in Wheat Ridge, Colorado, on December 7, 1979, on the 30th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this is where my story with Jehovah's Witnesses began.